So this tells you that perhaps TIC is very common in San Francisco. So you're going to be doing real estate in San Francisco, you might as well learn how to sell or buy TIC on behalf of your sellers or buyers. Now, if you're using, that's why, when you're doing transactions in San Francisco, it is better that you use the San Francisco purchase agreement as opposed to the CAR form, because there are many advisory forms that are only available in San Francisco AOR form library. If you use CAR form, you will be missing out a lot on the disclosures and advisories that are unique to San Francisco. Okay. Now here is one checkbox. It says here, if checked, this is a purchase of, and then there's a blank space over here. This blank space is for you to put in the amount of the interest that you're selling. That means that you're dealing with the seller of a TIC interest. A seller of a TIC interest only owns a fraction of the interest. Whatever that fraction is, you put it in here. Let's say, for example, you've been contacted by a seller in San Francisco. He says, I want to sell one of my units in San Francisco. Say, for example, in San Francisco, you may have one building, they have 4 separate rooms. You might think it's a condominium when it's not. That is basically a TIC interest. So somebody says that, well, I only own about 25% interest as a TIC in this building, and he wants you to sell that 25% interest. So you will go ahead and use this form and put in here 25%, for example, right? Let's say, for example, that he is selling 25%. Now, they call it undivided interest. By definition, the interests are undivided. If they don't have a TIC agreement, anybody can claim the right to use any corner, including the one that you're already using. So generally, in a TIC building, each TIC knows exactly which area they have agreed that he could use. Okay? So if there are 4 rooms, they would have signed an agreement whereby TIC A will use one room, and then TIC B will use another room, and then C, and then D. Okay? So they would have signed an agreement. So whoever that comes later, if you have a buyer that buys TICA's interest, his interest is derived from the buyer's interest is derived from TICA's interest. So if TICA interest owns 25%, undivided interest in the entire TIC property, that's what he owns, but it can be transferred from one person to another. And then also, if it's a TIC, there's a separate purchase addendum that you have to fill out. We'll look at the purchase addendum later on. And then there's a purchase price for it. Okay? So if the building is worth $1 million, the person that's selling the 25% interest might be able to sell it for $250,000, for example. Why is it so common in San Francisco? Because San Francisco has one of the highest price real estate in the entire United States, other than New York. So this is the place where there might be some that for you to fill out that has to do with TIC. So you will still use this purchase agreement. And then the rest, you just go ahead and fill them out accordingly, okay? Because the rest is just kind of like the regular purchase, right? Right. Okay. So that's one part you have to fill out. Now we're going to look at the TIC purchase addendum. Right here, this one right here. This is the addendum that has to be attached to the San Francisco purchase agreement if your seller is a TIC selling his interest. All right, this is what the form looks like. It says here, note, if the TIC interest described below is being sold for the first time as part of a newly formed TIC project with 5 or more units, the contract form and language must be approved in advance by the California Department of Real Estate. We studied in our real estate salesperson license course that if we have a subdivision project that has 5 or more units, that project must be approved by the Department of Real Estate. It works the same way for TIC with 5 or more units. Now, what's the difference between TIC with 5 or more units and a subdivision with a condominium with 5 or more units? The difference is in a condominium project of the 5 owners, each owner is entitled to receive an individual grant deed for his or her unit. Whereas if it's a TIC, the grant deed only transfers the TIC interest. It doesn't transfer the entire building unless you're buying the entire building, unless everyone is selling, okay? Which is generally not the case here. So if it is a newly formed TIC, newly formed means that it wasn't a TIC before, but now they made it into a TIC, okay? Then you need the DRE's approval. Now they changed the name already. It is now called DRE again. So we have to change our habit of calling the Department of Real Estate. We no longer call it BRE. We now call it DRE. Okay. So this is the TIC addendum. So let's see how we're going to fill this out. It says here the following terms and conditions are hereby incorporated in and made a part of the San Francisco Purchase Agreement. So this is made a part of the purchase agreement. Why do we need an addendum? There must be things that are not found in the standard purchase agreement that are unique to a TIC sale. That's why we have no place to put these provisions in the purchase agreement, nor are they appropriate for the standard purchase agreement anyway. Therefore, we need a separate addendum. It's called the TIC addendum. Okay? All right. Buyer's occupancy rights. Subject to buyer entering into a TIC agreement that defines all exclusive rights to purchase an undivided interest in an existing, or if checked, a newly created TIC. So if it is an existing TIC, you leave this alone. But if it's a brand new TIC, you check this box. It says subject to buyer entering into a TIC agreement. So that tells us that a buyer buys its interest from an existing seller. So whatever interest that the buyer gets is through the existing seller. However, if it's a brand new TIC, the buyer would have to enter into a TIC agreement. And it says here, buyers shall have the exclusive right to occupy unit. So let's say, among the TIC owners, they have reached an agreement about who's going to occupy what unit. So let's say TICA is going to occupy unit A, so you put down unit A right here. So if TICA is selling his 25% interest, then the buyer is getting the exclusive right to occupy unit A. And then it says here, buyer shall have the exclusive right to the following area. If you have a, if you have a TIC, there needs to be an agreement amongst all the TIC owners how they are going to make use of the parking spaces. So let's say, for example, there are 4 TIC owners and there are 4 parking spaces. And then let's say, for example, this TIC owner A gets the right to use parking space number 1. So it says 1. Storage space, if the TIC owner A has a certain right to use storage space, it has to be identified here. Deck, if the TIC A owner has the right to use the deck. Same thing with yard and or patio. Now this is, we're talking about exclusive. Most of the time they don't have exclusive right to use the yard and patio. Sometimes they do. So this has to be spelled out. Okay? And then other non-exclusive use common area, that has to be described here. So anything that is exclusive to unit A must be specified here. Buyer acknowledgement. The buyer acknowledges that buyer has received, read, and understood the attached TIC advisory. There is an advisory known as a TIC advisory. We'll get to that advisory in a little bit after we're through with this addendum. The buyer represents that buyer is not relying on any representation now, in the past, or in the future by seller or any broker's agent involved in the transaction with respect to the rights, use, and restrictions associated with the purchase of a TIC interest, but upon buyer's independent investigation. It's really, really ironic. If you buy real estate in California, the professionals are telling you that don't rely on us and don't rely on what the seller is telling you. But if you're a buyer, you hire professionals. So what does that mean? You still need to look for a lawyer to review this for you? That's exactly what it says here. But, in California, who hires a lawyer to buy real estate anyway? Hire a real estate agent, but each agent is telling you, don't rely on our advice. You should go get your own advice, okay? That's really the irony of buying real estate in California. Number 3, agrees to consult with a qualified real estate attorney who is knowledgeable and experienced in all applicable laws, including but not limited to TIC purchases, the California Subdivided Lands Act, residential landlord-tenant law, state and local, and other local laws regarding any questions buyer may have in any way related to TICs, TIC interest, TIC agreement, and all disclosed matters prior to removing conditions established by this addendum. Again, they even make the buyer agree to consult with a qualified real estate attorney, but in California, people buy real estate without consulting a real estate attorney. And that happens a lot, okay? And if you ask me why is it like that, I can't answer that. I just think that it's a strange system where, real estate attorneys are not involved in the transactions. Escrow is. We use escrow, but we don't use real estate attorney. If you go to New York and you go to Florida, people use real estate attorney to buy real estate. In California, we don't use a real estate attorney to buy real estate. However, in just about most of the advisory forms, they keep telling the buyer to look for a real estate attorney. Okay? I don't get this kind of business. I don't. Okay? But I just want to point out the irony here. Okay? They make the buyer agree to consult with a qualified real estate attorney. To me, that's somewhat hypocritical. Okay. Number 4, agrees to consult with a certified public accountant with respect to any and all financial or tax questions or issues related to ownership, financing, management, sale, or other disposition of the TIC interest prior to removing the conditions established by this amendment. Again, basically saying to the buyer that we're really not expert, so you should consult a CPA. In fact, that's what a buyer should do anyway. Because even buying just a TIC interest, I mean, we're not even talking about buying the entire building. We're just talking about buying a TIC interest. And the association's position is that, you should go talk to a real estate lawyer and you should go talk to a CPA. But let me ask you this. How many people actually consulted a real estate lawyer and a CPA before they close escrow? Very few. Okay. Number 3, tenancy in common agreement. A buyer is cautioned not to proceed without a TIC agreement in place. So basically, they advise the buyer to make sure that to confirm that there is a TIC agreement in place. This is very, very important. Let's say 2 individuals decided to invest in a property and they want to hold TIC interest and they don't do a TIC agreement. Oftentimes when they don't do a TIC agreement, they will find themselves in disagreements on many things, and then ultimately they decided to partition. All right. And then it says, buyer shall sign the TIC agreement and any amendments to it prior to the close of the escrow. The buyer should do that. That's true. Even not in San Francisco, even in other parts of California, you have 2 individuals deciding to invest together. You should always have a TIC agreement, because the TIC agreement can decide each party's rights and obligations. Says here, seller shall, within 7 days after acceptance, shall deliver to buyer a copy of the TIC agreement. So, as a listing agent, when you sign the listing, or after you sign the listing, make sure you get the TIC agreement from the seller so you can provide it to the buyer's agent. However, if the buyer has already received the TIC agreement, you just check here. And it says, if checked, buyer shall retain the qualified real estate attorney to create the TIC agreement. Now, sometimes people buy TIC interest without a TIC agreement. So if they don't have a TIC agreement, you would check this box because they need to retain qualified real estate attorney to create the TIC agreement, right? B, this agreement is or is not contingent upon buyer's approval of the TIC agreement. If you represent a buyer and the buyer is going to buy a TIC interest, the buyer would have to review the TIC agreement carefully to make sure that the buyer is okay with the terms and conditions in the TIC agreement. So buyer actually has that contingency. You can make it contingent, or non-contingent, but that's totally up to you. I would say that if you're going to buy a TIC interest, make sure you're okay with the terms and conditions. If the TIC agreements requires the other TIC co-owners' written consent to the sale of seller's interest, seller shall have 15 or any other days or other number of days after acceptance to deliver such consent to buyer. You know, sometimes a TIC building requires that any TIC owner, if they want to sell their interest, to get the written consent of the rest of the TIC owners before he can sell it. So if such consent is required, make sure you get the consent. Of course, if you can't get the consent, then you can't sell your interest. Financing, buyer will finance the amount specified in the purchase agreement as follows. Now, here they talk about group loan. This is talking about the loan for the entire TIC group. So one alternative for the buyer to get financing would be for the buyer to assume TICA's obligations under the terms of the group loan, okay? So that's one way to get financing. It says here, buyer will assume a portion of an existing group loan. The dollar amount of the group that buyer will assume is, so let's say, for example, the group loan is $600,000 and it's a 25% interest, so the buyer will assume $150,000 in the amount of the loan, one fourth. Sometimes it's easier to just go ahead and put in the percentage. So you have a choice of putting in the dollar amount or putting a percentage. So in this case, we put 25%. Okay, 25%. Obtaining approval of the lender of the group loan is not a contingency or is a contingency. So this is like a financing contingency. So if a buyer wants to buy a 25% TIC interest of A and wants to assume the group loan, and if the lender actually requires approval for the assumption, which in most cases, yes, the buyer can make it a contingency that in order to close escrow, the buyer must obtain approval of the lender for the group loan to assume the loan. Fractional TIC loan. Option A is assumption of the loan. Option B is what we call fractional TIC loan. That means that buyer is not assuming the group loan, however, the buyer will get its own loan. There are very few banks in San Francisco, maybe 2 or 3, that will do fractional loan, okay? They are out there, but there are very few of them. You can get fractional loan from fractional TIC loan from this specialty lender. Participation in the new group loan. You know, sometimes the TIC agreement may say that, well, if somebody wants to sell their interest, all the TICs would have to get a new loan. If that's the case, option C is what you are going to check. D, meeting and approval with other TIC groups for group loans. You know, you may need approval of the other TIC owners for a group loan. I think C is less likely and D is more likely. That's also one way to get financing, which is to get a new group loan. As you can see, it's a lot of work trying to buy a TIC interest. Seller release, and of course, seller must be released from any existing loan. If seller cannot get released, seller has the right to terminate this agreement. And One more option would be for the buyer to get seller financing. Okay, so basically the seller carry back, or the buyer can pay cash. So you have options A through G, which we just discussed. And number 5 talks about simultaneous sale of other TIC interests. You know, if one TIC is selling and another TIC is also selling, and you have more than one TIC selling at the same time, you know, sometimes it could be that you have multiple TIC selling their interests. If that's the case, you might have to use number 5. If within 90 days after acceptance, seller has not removed the contingency to sell the other TIC interests. Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. So sometimes the seller may have to sell simultaneously another TIC interest. What does that mean? Let's say, for example, you have TIC A. He owns 25% interest in building A. And then TIC A owns 25% interest in building B. And TIC A, after he sells off his TIC interest, he's going to buy either real estate or another TIC interest somewhere else. So if he only sells one TIC interest, he might not have enough cash to buy the next real estate. So he may make it a contingency. In order for me to close escrow, I have to sell 2 TIC interests in 2 separate buildings. Okay? So this situation might apply. If you have that situation, you have to check box number 5. And B here, 5B talks about sale of entire property and right of first refusal. If prior to seller entering into contracts for the sale of the other TIC interest, seller receives an offer for the purchase of the entire property, then seller may conditionally accept that offer as a backup contract. Seller shall then promptly notify buyer in writing the backup contract for the entire property, the price and terms of the backup contract, and the buyer has a right of first refusal to match the price and terms of that contract. The buyer does not sign a new unconditional contract matching the price and terms of the backup contract and provides seller with proof of buyer's financial ability to perform within 10 days receipt of seller's aforesaid notice to buyer, seller may terminate this agreement. You know, I think sometimes when a seller is selling a TIC interest, someone else showed up and said, I want to buy the entire building. Now, if you're a seller, you may be interested in selling the entire building as opposed to fractional interest. So if that's the case, but you're already in contract with this buyer who's only buying a fractional interest. So the way to handle this situation is, well, I would prefer to sell the entire building. So I put it in this condition that if somebody offered to buy the entire building, I will make that offer a backup offer. So if you are a buyer for the fractional interest, you could lose your right to purchase your fractional interest if you could lose your right to buy you could lose your right to buy this fractional interest if the seller finds a buyer who wants to buy the entire building. However, if you have enough money to buy the entire building, you get the right of first refusal. That's what this means. Okay. All right. Closing. Sale of undivided interest. Seller shall deliver to buyer all documents required by the TIC agreement prior to transfer of title to buyer. Buyer shall sign all documents necessary to transfer seller's interest to buyer. that were delivered to buyer specified in paragraph 3A. Notice something? There is no mention of escrow. The reason why there's no mention of escrow is because escrow is covered by the purchase agreement already. There's no need to mention escrow in here. Sale of multiple TIC interests. Now it has A, we talk about sale of individual TIC interests, and B talks about sale of multiple TIC interests. It says here, close of escrow shall occur simultaneously with the sale of other TIC interests from another building, not same building, but from another building. So you got sale of two separate interests, or more, more than one interest if it's a multiple TIC interest. TIC agreement cost. Seller shall pay for new TIC agreement amendments to an existing TIC. So if a new TIC agreement is required, seller has to pay an attorney to draft the TIC agreement. Okay? And if you have any other terms, you can go ahead and fill out number 8 here. Okay? Now let's go on to the advisory and the disclosure. So we covered the purchase contract, the TIC addendum, now the TIC advisory. Here, this is the TIC advisory. Now, what's the purpose of the advisory? Advisory serves as advice or warnings to the buyer. You know, it is to educate the buyer what are the risks of buying a TIC interest. One of the risks that come to mind is it's very difficult to get a loan. There are only a handful of lenders that are willing to loan fractional TIC interest. However, you can get the loan. It's just that the interest rate might be higher than other types of loans. So bear in mind, it's actually more expensive. But some people, they don't have the ability to buy the entire property, especially in San Francisco. There are people that are living below the average person, so they don't have a lot of money. They've been saving and saving and saving for years to come out with enough money to buy a TIC interest, but they cannot buy the entire building. And the first thing that they warn about is, it says here, number 1, last sentence of the paragraph, it says the current TIC marketplace is made up of resales of existing TIC interests and the creation of new TICs. TIC is very common in San Francisco. It tells you that TIC is not condominium. Don't think that, you know, you have a condominium. You don't. A current TIC agreement is strongly recommended. We talked about that. Basically, the buyer needs to make sure that there is a well-written TIC agreement. Potential problems that the TIC may not solve. TIC agreement. TIC agreement does not solve all problems. There are certain things that cannot be solved by TIC agreement. For example, if one of the owners goes into bankruptcy, if it's a condominium, if it's an individual condominium owner goes into bankruptcy, it may still affect other property owners, other condo owners. However, the impact is a lot smaller than in a TIC situation. TIC, if somebody files bankruptcy, it could potentially affect everybody else in that TIC building. Okay? So basically, these are questions to be answered by a real estate attorney. Also, they want to warn the buyer about rent control issue or wrongful termination issue. Rent control talks about the control of the rent increase and also eviction control. Okay. Now, wrongful termination talks about a landlord who wrongfully evicted a tenant. That's what a wrongful termination is. Also, it talks about joint liability. If an accident occurs in the unit that one owner of a TIC exclusively occupies, leading to claims of joint liability against the other owners. You know, like when you are in a condominium, if somebody slip and fall in a condo unit, it is only the owner of the individual unit who's going to be responsible to the victim. However, if somebody slips and falls in a unit exclusively occupied by a TIC owner, because the interest is undivided, all of the TIC owners would be responsible to the victim. So that's a big difference there. Okay? Usually they have insurance to cover that. Sometimes it's harder to sell a TIC interest because there is loan involved. If it's a group loan, the problem with group loan is that if one TIC owner wants to sell its interest, that group loan must be assumed by the buyer. So the buyer has less option. So in other words, some buyer does not want to assume a loan. They will walk away from buying that TIC interest. So if you have group loan, the advantage is that it's easier to get property insurance. But if you have individual loans, think about if 4 owners getting their own loans, there are 4 different loans on the property. So having a group loan will solve the problem on property insurance, but it creates a different problem because the buyer will have to assume the group loan. The buyer cannot get their own fractional interest, fractional loan. Okay, so something to keep in mind to a buyer buying a TIC interest. Okay. Of course, the TIC agreement requires the TIC owners to maintain a record of the comprehensive financial and governance records. In a condominium situation, usually you have the HOA to take care of that. But in the TIC situation, all 4 owners would have to cooperate, okay, to maintain the financial and governance records. So if you're a buyer of a TIC interest, you might want to review the financial records. It's actually more work for the agent representing a buyer to buy a TIC interest. And basically, number 6 tells the buyer that they have to do thorough investigation they say buyers are strongly encouraged to investigate the condition of the entire property and the financial stability and compatibility of the prospective co-owners before committing to purchase a TIC interest. A transfer disclosure statement prepared by a seller of an undivided interest in the TIC may reflect only the seller's knowledge of the area where the seller resides and not the remainder of the property. So if you get a transfer disclosure statement from a seller of a TIC interest, now the law says 1 to 4 units, you need to provide, the seller need to provide a transfer disclosure statement. What if you're not selling 1 to 4 units? You are selling a fractional interest, right? So by definition, you're not selling a 1 unit. If you're not selling a 1 unit, are you still required to do a transfer disclosure statement? I think you're not required because you're not selling a unit. You're not selling a condominium. You're selling a TIC fractional interest. I think it would be unfair for the seller to give a transfer disclosure statement. My position is that in this situation, you don't have to provide a transfer disclosure statement because whatever you provide is not going to be accurate because you know what? You're only disclosing what's in your individual unit. Well, I suppose that if I'm a buyer, I'd rather the seller provide me with a imperfect transfer disclosure statement than no disclosure at all. Shared property taxes. Now, if you're a buyer, you know that because it's the TIC owners actually all contribute to the property tax. They only get one property tax bill. They don't get 4 property tax bill, one only. So somebody would have to tell the rest of the TIC owners how much each person is required to contribute to the property tax. Okay? Now, here number 8 says no assurance of condominium conversion. You know what? It's very common in the Bay Area for TIC owners to apply for condo conversion to get out of TIC situation. Now, what kind of people will buy TIC interest? The people who are less well-to-do financially will go for TIC interest because they don't have the ability to buy the entire building, so they buy TIC interest. Okay, or sometimes it could be that person is a single person, or maybe his buddies all live in the same building, and he just wants to be part of the TIC. Okay, now the advantages of TIC is that they just need to pay a fraction of the interest. Okay, and generally property that is made up of TICs, they are priced lower than properties that have been converted to condominium. Think about it. Who would want to convert a TIC into condominium if it's an investor? If I'm an investor, I will convert a TIC into a condominium because each individual condo unit is actually worth more than the individual TIC. So I have incentive to convert them into condo. Right? Now, number 8 basically tells the buyer that, owning a TIC interest does not guarantee that you'll be successful in your condo conversion. There are many different reasons why a condo conversion is not successful. Sometimes it has to do with the physicalness of the building. Some buildings just can't be converted into a condominium because they don't meet the requirements of building code. Okay? So owning a TIC does not guarantee that you will get the conversion. Plus, as you know, in San Francisco, in order to convert into condominium, they have what they call a waiting time. You have to wait for years and years and years and years because too many people apply for condo conversion. And they don't want to everybody to apply at the same time because that will flood the market. That will create an impact. Because whenever there's a condo conversion, chances are some tenants will be evicted because there is no rent control or eviction control after the condo conversion is successful. That's why they don't want too many condo conversions in a given year. Maximum 200 per year, 200 applications they will approve in a year. Okay, 200 is a very small number. Okay, it's not 200 they will approve, 200 they will accept. Okay, and of the 200, maybe not all will be approved. Some will not be approved. Okay. Financing. Now, this one basically advised to the buyer that it is very difficult to get fractional TIC loan. Only a handful of lenders actually will provide fractional TIC loan. Okay. Group loan. Now, what do they say about group loan that is negative? They say a group loan is shared by multiple co-owners and secured by the entire property. As a result, Each owner relies on the other owners to meet their loan obligations. Just imagine someone else, 4 people, one person is always late on submitting their loan payment. What's going to happen? Now, if one person is late, the entire group is late, right? Now, if the entire group is late, would that affect your credit? That would affect your credit, wouldn't it? So I think that's another problem. It's a group loan. If it's a fractional loan, you're only responsible for yourself. Whereas if it's a group loan, everybody is responsible for the entire group. Okay? Potential cash purchase issues. Buyers intending to forego financing to be secured by property and pay the complete sales price in cash. Advised to seek legal advice regarding the effect of any existing or proposed group loan or fractional loans on buyer's interest in the property. You know, when you have like a group loan and you are paying cash, sometimes, you know, certain loans don't allow early payoff. Although I think these days we don't have any residential loans that come with prepayment penalty. That's already abolished. They don't allow prepayment penalty on residential loan if it's owner occupied. Whereas if it's an investment property residential loans, this prepayment penalty is still allowed. Okay. Resale risk. Resale risk has to do with sometimes certain TIC agreement requires the universal consent of all the owners before any owner can sell their fractional interest. So that's something for the buyer to pay attention to, because that will make it harder for you to sell your interest. What if you don't get along with one of the owners? And if he doesn't give you consent, now you got a problem, don't you? Now, what do you do if one owner does not give consent and the other owner wants to sell? Partition. Partition, then you have to go to court for that. So, you know, that's why I know they created these forms because there's a demand for this form. So as you can see, there's a demand for TIC interest in San Francisco because so many people are buying TIC interest in San Francisco because it is so expensive to own a property in San Francisco. Now let's talk about Alice Act. If you don't know what Alice Act means, if you're a landlord in a rent control area, you cannot terminate your tenancy with a landlord without good cause. Good cause means the tenant did not pay rent, the tenant has violated a condition in the property, in the lease, and you want to move onto the property, or one of your relatives want to move on your property. These are all good causes. If you don't have any of these good causes, you cannot end your tenancy with a rent control tenant. And Alice Act is another good cause. Alice Act means that the landlord has decided to remove the rental property from the rental market. It doesn't mean the landlord is going to stay there. The landlord has decided not to be in the rental business anymore. That's what Alice Act is for. Okay? Now, it says here, if a state law commoning known as Alice Act has been previously invoked to terminate all residential tenancy on the property, subsequently sold as TICs, the owners of the TIC interest may be subject to restrictions on the future rental units for which they have an exclusive use. What this means is, you know, let's say, for example, you're a TIC owner. Even a TIC owner may decide to rent out their own unit. But if the entire building was previously rented as a rental property, and then the previous owner took it back, and then converted the building into a TIC building, and then sold the TIC interest individually, eventually, if one of the TIC owners decides to rent out their unit to another tenant, there may be certain restrictions on doing that. Okay? Just keep that in mind. Rent control and vacancy control. Something for the TIC owner to know. The legal rights and interests of TIC owners are impacted by many and far-reaching tenants' rights laws. Okay? The right to occupy a dwelling unit already occupied by a tenant or to convert a building with a history of evictions on condominiums may be severely restricted. Now, let's say, for example, if you're buying a TIC interest from, let's say, Unit A, and in Unit A, there's already a tenant, and that is a rent-controlled unit, you may not be able to recover it unless you are doing an owner-user, which means that you're moving in. So in other words, if you buy a TIC interest as an investment, and the unit is rented to a tenant, you may not be able to end the tenancy if you are not moving in. Okay, something for you to keep in mind. And of course, they advise you to get advice from qualified real estate attorney. Okay, which they should anyway, but how many people do that now? In my 24 years of business, I probably make very little money from giving legal advice on real estate purchase. Okay. Most of the money I make is actually from real estate litigation and not from doing this kind of work. Every time I see provision like this, I kind of smile. Because in my 24 years, if I rely on these misters, I would starve. Okay? No way I could make a living doing this. Because you know why? How many buyers actually go talk to a lawyer before they close escrow? Very, very few, right? All right, thank you for joining me. Talk to you guys later.